The dust never settled in Mercy Ridge. It hung in the air like a constant reminder of how small they all were beneath the endless sky, how temporary their claims to this hard-baked earth really amounted to. From his perch on the porch outside the sheriff's office, Ethan McKinnon watched it swirl in lazy spirals, kicked up by the occasional horse or the wind that came down from the mountains like a sigh. 22 years old, and he felt ancient some days. The weight of his father's badge seemed to press against his chest even when he wasn't wearing it, even when he was just Ethan, not the sheriff's son, not the next in line to carry the law in Mercy Ridge. But those moments were rare. In a town this small, you were never just yourself. Boy, his father's voice cut through the afternoon heat like the crack of a whip. Sheriff McKinnon stood in the doorway, his shadow falling long across the weathered boards. Stop your wool gathering. We got word from Carson City. Ethan straightened, pushing his hat back on his head. The sun caught the badge pinned to his vest. Deputy, not sheriff, though everyone knew it was just a matter of time. What kind of word? The bad kind. McKinnon stepped onto the porch, his boots announcing each step with authority. Even approaching 60, he moved like a man half his age, all coiled strength and sharp edges. 3 men hit the bank there yesterday, got away clean with near $2,000. They heading this way? Could be. Description matches some boys been causing trouble up north. One of them. McKinnon's eyes narrowed, studying something in the distance that only he could see. One of them sounds like Cole Brennan. The name hit Ethan like cold water. Everyone in this part of the territory knew about Cole Brennan, though precious few had seen him up close and lived to give a proper description. The stories varied depending on who was telling them. Sometimes he was a cold-blooded killer, sometimes a gentleman bandit who never drew on an unarmed man. Sometimes he rode alone, sometimes with a gang of cutthroats. The only thing that stayed constant was the price on his head. $500, dead or alive. You sure it's him? Sure enough. McKinnon's hand rested on the grip of his Colt, a gesture so habitual Ethan doubted his father even realized he was doing it. Young, dark hair, quiet-spoken, rides a black gelding with white markings. Could be coincidence, but I don't believe in those. Ethan nodded, though something twisted in his gut. He'd been hearing stories about Cole Brennan for 2 years now, ever since the outlaw first appeared on wanted posters across 3 territories. But hearing his father speak the name with such certainty made it real in a way that made his mouth go dry. What do you want me to do? Same as always. Keep your eyes open, your gun loose, and your mouth shut until I tell you otherwise. McKinnon's gaze finally settled on his son, and there was something in it Ethan couldn't quite read. Pride, maybe, or worry. This isn't some drunk cowboy or cattle rustler boy. Men like Brennan don't get to be legends by being careless. The afternoon stretched on without incident. Ethan made his usual rounds, checking on Miss Henderson's store, nodding to the men gathered outside the saloon, making sure the kids weren't getting into too much trouble down by the creek. Mercy Ridge was a good town, the kind of place where most folks knew right from wrong and acted accordingly. But it was also the kind of place where a man like Cole Brennan could disappear into the landscape like smoke if he had a mind to. By evening, the heat had begun to lift, though it would be hours yet before the air turned cool enough to be comfortable. Ethan stood at the edge of the town, looking out at the road that wound away toward the mountains. Somewhere out there, men with blood on their hands and money in their saddlebags might be riding toward Mercy Ridge. Or maybe they'd gone another direction entirely, toward Mexico or California, or any of a dozen other places a man could lose himself if he was clever enough. The sound of hoofbeats made him turn. A single rider was coming up the road, still distant enough that the heat shimmer made him waver like a mirage. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to his gun, though he forced himself not to draw. Could be anyone, a drifter looking for work, a cowboy heading home, a traveling salesman with a case full of worthless trinkets. But something about the way the man sat his horse, the deliberate pace of his approach, made the hair on the back of Ethan's neck stand up. As the rider drew closer, details began to emerge from the wavering air. Young, like his father had said, dark hair showing beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and riding a black horse with white markings on its legs just visible through the dust. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The rider was 20 yards away when he finally looked up, and their eyes met across the empty space between them. For a moment that felt like eternity, neither of them moved. The stranger's face was lean and sun-weathered, with the kind of stillness that comes from spending too much time alone. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, his gun worn low on his hip in a way that spoke of use rather than show. And his eyes. Christ, his eyes were the palest blue Ethan had ever seen, like winter sky or deep water. They studied Ethan with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if every secret he'd ever carried was written plain across his face. "Evening," the stranger said, his voice carrying easily across the distance between them. It was a good voice, low and steady with just a hint of an accent Ethan couldn't quite place. "Evening?" Ethan's own voice came out rougher than he'd intended. He cleared his throat, straightened his shoulders, tried to remember he was a deputy sheriff with a job to do. "You heading into town?" "Just passing through." The man's gaze flicked to the badge on Ethan's vest, then back to his face. "Won't be any trouble." "Most folks say that." Ethan took a step closer, his hand still resting on his gun. "Doesn't always turn out to be true." Something that might have been a smile ghosted across the stranger's lips. Gone so quickly, Ethan almost missed it. "I suppose it doesn't." They stood there in the gathering dusk, each taking the measure of the other. Ethan could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, though he couldn't say whether it was fear or something else entirely. The man before him could be Cole Brennan. Everything about him matched the description, right down to the black horse and the quiet way he held himself. But he could also be exactly what he claimed to be, just another drifter looking for a place to water his horse and maybe buy a drink. "You got a name?" Ethan asked finally. The pause stretched out long enough that Ethan began to think he wouldn't get an answer. Then, Cole. Just that. Just Cole. Offered up like it was the most natural thing in the world, like he wasn't sitting on a horse worth more than most men made in a year, with a gun that had probably killed more than one man and a price on his head that would set a working family up for life. "Cole?" Ethan repeated, tasting the name. "Got a last name to go with that?" "Do I need one?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them was quite ready to name. Ethan knew he should demand proper identification, should march this man straight to his father and let the sheriff sort it out. That was what his badge meant, what his duty demanded. Instead, he found himself stepping back, clearing the road. "Saloon's down the main street," he said. "Mrs. Carson runs a clean place. Good food, better whiskey." Cole nodded, gathering his reins. "Obliged." He rode past without another word, close enough that Ethan could have reached out and touched his boot. Close enough to smell horse and leather and something else, something that made him think of campfires and open sky. Their eyes met again as he passed, and this time Ethan was certain he saw something flicker in those pale depths. Surprise, maybe? Or gratitude? Or maybe just the reflection of his own confusion. Ethan watched until horse and rider disappeared into the shadows of the main street, then stood there for a long time after, staring at nothing and trying to make sense of what had just happened. He'd let Cole Brennan, because it had to be Cole Brennan no matter what his gut was telling him about coincidences, ride into Mercy Ridge without so much as asking to see what was in his saddlebags. His father would have his hide if he found out. Hell, his father should have his hide. By the time Ethan made it back to the sheriff's office, full dark had settled over the town. The saloon was alive with noise and light, piano music and laughter spilling out into the street. Somewhere in that crowd, a wanted man was buying drinks and maybe charming the locals with stories of the trail. Or maybe he was sitting alone in a corner, watching the doors and planning his next move. "There you are." McKinnon looked up from his desk where he'd been cleaning his rifle with the same methodical attention he gave everything. "Thought you might have gotten yourself lost." "Just making rounds." Ethan hung his hat on the peg by the door, trying to keep his voice casual. "All quiet out there." "Good." McKinnon's eyes were sharp in the lamplight, studying his son's face with the same intensity he'd used to read tracks. "No sign of our friends from Carson City?" "Nothing." The lie came easier than it should have, slipping off Ethan's tongue like it belonged there. "If they're coming this way, they're taking their time about it." McKinnon grunted, apparently satisfied, and turned back to his rifle. "Well, they'll turn up eventually. Men like that always do. Question is whether they'll turn up peaceful or otherwise." Ethan nodded and made appropriate noises, but his mind was across the street, wondering what Cole was doing right now. Whether he was planning to slip out of town under cover of darkness, or if he really was just passing through like he'd claimed. Whether those pale eyes had seen right through him the same way he'd tried to see through Cole. Whether he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life or something else entirely. The next morning dawned clear and hot, with the promise of another scorching day written in the cloudless sky. Ethan was up before dawn, unable to sleep for the weight of his thoughts. And by the time his father stirred, he'd already made coffee and checked on the horses. "You're up early," McKinnon observed, pouring himself a cup from the pot Ethan had left warming on the stove. "Couldn't sleep." That much at least was true. McKinnon studied him over the rim of his cup, those sharp eyes missing nothing. "Something on your mind, boy?" "Everything," Ethan wanted to say. "A man who might be the most wanted outlaw in 3 territories bought a drink in our saloon last night, and I let him do it. I looked into his eyes and saw something that made me forget every lesson you've ever taught me about duty and justice and doing what's right." Instead, he just shrugged. "Just thinking. Dangerous habit." But McKinnon was smiling as he said it, the rare expression transforming his weathered features. "Your mother used to say the same thing about me. Robert McKinnon," she'd say. "You think too much for your own good." The mention of his mother always hit Ethan like a physical blow even after all these years. She'd been dead since he was 12, taken by fever one brutal winter, and sometimes he thought his father missed her more than he'd ever admit. Certainly more than he'd ever say out loud. "She was probably right," Ethan said softly. "Usually was." McKinnon drained his cup and set it aside. "Come on, those rounds won't make themselves." They walked the streets of Mercy Ridge together, father and son, badges catching the early morning light. Everything seemed normal. Mrs. Henderson sweeping her porch, the blacksmith already at work despite the early hour, children playing in the dust while their mothers hung laundry. But Ethan found his eyes drawn constantly to the saloon, dark and quiet now in the growing light. "You checked the hotel register yet?" McKinnon asked as they passed the small building that served as Mercy Ridge's only accommodation for travelers. Ethan's heart skipped. "Not yet. Want me to?" "Might be worth doing. If our friends from Carson City are in the area, they'll need somewhere to hole up." Old Pete, who ran the hotel, was more than happy to let the sheriff and his deputy look through his register. There were only 3 guests currently staying: a cattle buyer from Denver, a widow woman traveling to visit her sister, and someone who'd signed the book simply as Masters. "When did he check in?" McKinnon asked, his finger tracing the entry. "Last night, Sheriff." "Quiet fella, paid in advance. Said he'd probably be moving on today or tomorrow." McKinnon and Ethan exchanged glances. "He say where he was headed?" "Nope. Like I said, quiet type. Kept his hat pulled low, didn't make much conversation." Pete scratched his graying beard. "Seemed polite enough, though. Asked after a place to stable his horse, thanked me proper when I showed him to his room." "What's he look like?" McKinnon's voice was carefully neutral, but Ethan could hear the tension underneath. "Young fella, maybe 25 or so. Dark hair, pale eyes. Rides a good-looking black horse with white markings. Why? He in some kind of trouble?" McKinnon didn't answer directly. "We'd like to have a word with him." "He around?" "Left early this morning, said he wanted to see the country before the heat got too bad. Took some supplies with him, but left his things in the room, so I expect he'll be back." Outside, McKinnon's expression was grim. "Well, there's our boy. Question is, what's he really doing here?" Ethan's mouth had gone dry. "Maybe he's telling the truth. Maybe he is just passing through. And maybe I'm the Queen of England." McKinnon adjusted his gun belt, a gesture Ethan recognized as preparation for trouble. "No, son. Men like Cole Brennan don't just pass through places like Mercy Ridge. They come here for a reason." The day dragged on with agonizing slowness. Every time someone entered the sheriff's office, Ethan's heart jumped. Every horse he heard on the street made him look up from whatever he was pretending to work on. His father seemed to sense his agitation but didn't comment, just kept cleaning his guns and checking their ammunition with the methodical patience of a man who'd been wearing a badge for more than 20 years. It was nearly sunset when the door opened and Cole Brennan walked in. He moved with the same quiet grace Ethan remembered from the night before, his pale eyes taking in the room's details before settling on the 2 men behind the desk. He'd removed his hat, revealing hair dark as midnight and features that belonged in a painting more than on a wanted poster. "Sheriff?" he said, his voice as calm as if he were discussing the weather. "Deputy." McKinnon's hand was already on his gun, though he hadn't drawn it yet. "Mr. Brennan, I presume?" Cole didn't deny it, didn't even seem surprised. "That's right." You know why I'd want to talk to you? I can guess. Cole's gaze flicked to Ethan, and for just a moment something passed between them. A question maybe, or an acknowledgement of what had happened the night before. Carson City? Among other things. McKinnon rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate and controlled. You're wanted for bank robbery, cattle theft, and murder in 3 territories. That's a lot of sins for one man to carry. I suppose it is. Cole's hand hung loose at his side, nowhere near his gun. What do you intend to do about it? The question was directed at McKinnon, but Cole was looking at Ethan when he asked it. Those pale eyes seemed to see right through him, to the confusion and conflict churning in his chest. Ethan felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with guns or badges or the space between them. My job, McKinnon said finally. Same as I always do. And what might that be? Bring you in. There's a federal marshal in Tombstone who'll be real interested to meet you. Cole nodded as if this was exactly what he'd expected. And if I don't want to come, then I'll make you. McKinnon's voice was steel wrapped in silk. But I'd rather not if it's all the same to you. This is a peaceful town, Mr. Brennan. I'd like to keep it that way. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the tick of the clock on the wall and the distant noise from the saloon. Ethan found himself holding his breath, watching the space between his father and the wanted man, waiting for someone to make the move that would decide how this ended. It was Cole who broke the silence. All right, he said, and began to unbuckle his gun belt. Ethan stared in disbelief as Cole set his weapons on McKinnon's desk with the same care another man might use handling china. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to every story he'd ever heard about desperate outlaws, that for a moment he wondered if they'd made some terrible mistake. Just like that? McKinnon's voice betrayed his own surprise. Just like that. Cole straightened, his hands visible and empty. I'm tired, Sheriff. Tired of running, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of sleeping with one eye open. Maybe it's time to face what I've done? McKinnon studied him for a long moment, then nodded to Ethan. Get the shackles, boy. Ethan moved toward the wall where the restraints hung, his feet feeling like they were made of lead. This was wrong somehow. Everything about this moment felt wrong, though he couldn't say exactly why. Cole Brennan was a wanted man, a criminal, someone who deserved whatever justice the law saw fit to deliver. So why did it feel like they were making a mistake? Deputy. Ethan turned, shackles in hand, to find Cole watching him with those unsettling pale eyes. Thank you, Cole said quietly. For last night. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. His father's head snapped around, those sharp eyes moving between his son and the prisoner. What's he talking about, Ethan? The moment stretched out like taffy, sweet and terrible and inescapable. Ethan could feel his father's gaze boring into him, could see the questions forming behind those weathered features. He could lie, probably. Make up some story about checking on a disturbance, about professional courtesy. His father might even believe him. But Cole was still looking at him with something that might have been gratitude or respect, or something else entirely. Something that made Ethan's chest tight and his hands shake as he held the cold metal of the shackles. I met him yesterday evening, Ethan said finally, when he rode into town. And I let him pass. The silence that followed was deafening. McKinnon's face went through several expressions, surprise, disappointment, anger, before settling into something Ethan couldn't read. Why? The single word carried the weight of 20 years of training, of trust, of everything that had ever passed between father and son. Ethan looked at Cole, then back at his father, then at the badge on his own chest. I don't know. It was the truth, or as close to it as he could manage. He didn't know why he'd stepped aside, why he'd let a wanted man ride into their town without challenge. He only knew that looking into those pale eyes had made something shift inside him, something he didn't have words for. McKinnon was quiet for a long time, processing this revelation. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Put the shackles on him, Ethan. The words were an order, but they were also a test. Ethan could hear it in his father's tone, could see it in the way McKinnon watched him approach the prisoner. This was his chance to prove that whatever had happened the night before was an aberration, a moment of poor judgment that wouldn't be repeated. Ethan moved toward Cole, the metal heavy in his hands. The outlaw didn't resist, didn't even seem to breathe as Ethan fastened the restraints around his wrists. But when their hands touched, skin brushing skin as Ethan worked the mechanism, something electric passed between them. Cole's fingers were long and calloused, warm with life, and for just a moment Ethan found himself wondering what those hands had done, what stories they could tell. "There," he said, stepping back. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. Cole looked down at the shackles, then back up at Ethan. "Obliged." McKinnon stood and reached for his hat. "I'll wire Tombstone. Let them know we've got their boy. They'll probably want to send someone to collect him." "How long will that take?" Ethan asked. "Day or two, maybe 3. Depends on how eager they are." McKinnon settled his hat on his head and checked his pocket watch. "I'm going to make arrangements with Pete for a secure room. You stay here with the prisoner." "Dad, that's Sheriff McKinnon while we're on duty, Deputy." The correction was gentle but firm, a reminder of hierarchy and protocol. "And this is still your job, whatever else might be going through your head. Don't forget that." McKinnon left without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft click. Suddenly, the room felt smaller, the space between Ethan and Cole charged with something neither of them seemed willing to name. "Your father's a good man," Cole said finally. "He is." Ethan moved to the window, looking out at the street where his father was walking toward the hotel. "He's also not one to forget when someone lies to him." "Is that what you did?" "Lie to him?" Ethan turned from the window to find Cole watching him with that same unsettling intensity. "I didn't tell him about meeting you." "That's the same thing." "Maybe, or maybe it's something else entirely." "What's that supposed to mean?" Cole was quiet for a moment, studying his shackled hands. When he looked up, his pale eyes held something Ethan couldn't quite identify. "I've been running for 2 years, Deputy. 2 years of sleeping rough and eating beans and wondering if every sunrise might be my last. In all that time, only one person has ever looked at me and seen something besides a bounty to collect or a threat to eliminate." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Cole's voice was soft, almost gentle. "Last night, when we met on the road, you had your hand on your gun. You knew something wasn't right about me. But you let me pass anyway. Why?" Ethan opened his mouth to deny it, to claim it was simple professional courtesy or a moment of poor judgment. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself remembering that first moment of contact, the way something had shifted in his chest when their eyes met. "I don't know," he said again. "I think you do." Cole leaned back in his chair, the chains rattling softly. "I think you saw the same thing I did." "Which was what?" "Recognition." The word hung in the air between them like smoke, heavy with implication. Ethan felt his heart hammering against his ribs, felt heat rising in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "You're wrong," he said. "Am I?" Before Ethan could answer, the door opened and McKinnon returned, his expression grim. "Pete's got a room in the back we can use," he announced. "No windows, solid door with a good lock. Should hold him until the marshal's men get here." "When will that be?" Ethan asked. "Day after tomorrow, if all goes well." McKinnon's eyes moved between his son and the prisoner, noting the tension in the room. "Everything all right here?" "Fine," Ethan said quickly. "Just making conversation." McKinnon's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but he didn't press the issue. "Come on then, let's get Mayor Brennan settled for the night." The walk to the hotel was surreal. Cole moved between them with quiet dignity, his chains marking time against the silence. A few townspeople stopped to stare. Word of the capture had apparently spread already, but most gave them a wide berth. Mercy Ridge was the kind of place where people minded their own business, especially when that business involved wanted men and federal marshals. Pete had prepared a room at the back of the building, small and windowless but clean. There was a cot, a wash basin, and nothing else that could be used as a weapon or tool for escape. McKinnon tested the lock twice, then posted himself outside the door. "I'll take first watch," he told Ethan. "You get some rest." Tomorrow's going to be a long day. Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to insist he could handle guard duty, but something in his father's tone told him it wouldn't be wise. Instead, he nodded and made his way back to their small house behind the sheriff's office, his mind churning with questions he couldn't answer. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams he couldn't remember and a restlessness that followed him into the dawn. The next day passed in a haze of routine duties and distracted thoughts. Ethan made his rounds, filed reports, and tried to act like everything was normal while his mind kept drifting to the small room where Cole Brennan sat waiting for federal justice. Twice he found excuses to check on the prisoner, bringing food or fresh water, though McKinnon watched these visits with growing suspicion. "You seem mighty concerned about our guest's comfort," the sheriff observed after Ethan returned from his second visit. "Just doing my job. Is that what you call it?" McKinnon's voice was carefully neutral, but Ethan could hear the question underneath. "What else would I call it?" McKinnon studied his son's face for a long moment, then shook his head. "I don't know, boy. That's what worries me." By evening, the tension in the sheriff's office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Ethan found himself jumping at every sound, his nerves strung tight as piano wire. When McKinnon announced he was going home for supper and sleep, leaving Ethan to take the night watch, it felt like both a relief and a trial by fire. "Keep your wits about you," McKinnon warned as he prepared to leave. "Brennan seems cooperative now, but desperate men do desperate things. Don't let your guard down." "I won't." "And Ethan?" McKinnon paused in the doorway, his weathered face serious in the lamplight. "Whatever's going through your head about this man, remember what he is. Remember what he's done." Ethan nodded, though his throat felt too tight for words. McKinnon studied him for another moment, then left without further comment. The night watch at the hotel was quiet. Pete had gone to bed hours ago, leaving Ethan alone with his thoughts and the sound of Cole's breathing from behind the locked door. Twice he dozed off in his chair, jerking awake with his hand on his gun and his heart racing. The third time it happened, he gave up on sleep entirely and began pacing the hallway. It was nearly midnight when Cole's voice drifted through the door. "Can't sleep either?" Ethan stopped pacing. "You should be resting. Tomorrow's going to be a long day for you." "Maybe." There was a rustling sound, as if Cole was shifting position on his cot. "Or maybe it'll be my last day depending on how things go in Tombstone. They'll give you a fair trial." Cole's laugh held no humor. "Will they? A wanted man caught with a bag of stolen money and blood on his hands? I think we both know how that story ends." Ethan found himself standing closer to the door than he'd intended, close enough to hear the quiet rasp of Cole's breathing. "Maybe you'll get lucky." "Maybe." Another pause, then, "Deputy? Yeah? Can I ask you something?" Ethan glanced down the hall toward the front of the hotel, making sure they were still alone. "I suppose. What did you see when you looked at me that first night? Out on the road?" The question hit Ethan like a physical blow, dragging him back to that moment of first contact. He remembered the way his heart had hammered, the way something had shifted in his chest when their eyes met, across the dusty space between them. "I saw a man," he said finally. "Just a man? What else should I have seen?" "A killer. An outlaw. Someone your father would tell you to stay away from." Ethan pressed his palm against the door, as if he could somehow reach through the wood to the man on the other side. "Maybe I should have. But you didn't." "No, I didn't." They were quiet for a long time after that, the silence heavy with unspoken things. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel the warmth of the door against his palm. On the other side, Cole was so close they might have been able to touch if not for the barrier between them. "I never killed anyone who didn't deserve it," Cole said suddenly. "What?" "Those murders they have me wanted for. I never killed anyone who didn't deserve it." Cole's voice was soft, almost confessional. "The man in Tucson was beating his wife to death. The one in Silver City was about to rape a girl barely old enough to be out of school. I did what the law wouldn't do." Ethan felt something twist in his chest. "And the banks? The money? Hungry people need to eat. Kids need medicine. Sometimes the only difference between justice and crime is who's writing the story. That's not how the law works." "Isn't it?" Cole's voice held a note of challenge. "Your father's a good man, Deputy, but he works for a system that protects the rich and powerful while the poor starve in the street. Sometimes a man has to choose between what's legal and what's right. And you chose what's right? I chose to try. Maybe that makes me a fool, but it doesn't make me a killer." Ethan closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the door. Everything Cole was saying went against everything his father had taught him about law and order, about the way justice was supposed to work. But there was something in the outlaw's voice, a quiet conviction, a pain that seemed too real to be fabricated. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because tomorrow I'll be gone. and you'll be left wondering what kind of man you helped capture. I wanted you to know the truth, even if it doesn't change anything." "Maybe it does." The words slipped out before Ethan could stop them, hanging in the air like a confession. He held his breath, waiting for Cole to respond, waiting for the sky to fall or the world to end or something to mark the moment when everything changed. "Maybe," Cole said softly, "or maybe some things are just too broken to fix." They talked through the night, their voices low and careful, separated by wood and metal, but connected by something neither of them was quite willing to name. Cole told him stories of the trail, of places he'd seen and people he'd met. Ethan found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone. His doubts about following in his father's footsteps, his restlessness with small-town life, his dreams of seeing what lay beyond the horizon. As dawn approached, their conversation grew quieter, more intimate. The space between them seemed to shrink despite the physical barriers, until Ethan felt like he could reach out and touch the man on the other side of the door. "What happens now?" he asked as the first light began to creep through the hotel's front windows. "Now the marshals come and I go to Tombstone to face whatever's waiting for me there. And after that?" Cole was quiet for so long that Ethan began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "After that, I guess we'll see what kind of man you really are, Deputy McKinnon." The marshals arrived just after noon, two hard-faced men who looked like they'd spent their lives chasing outlaws across impossible distances. They examined their prisoner with professional dispassion, checked his restraints, and prepared to load him into their wagon for the journey to Tombstone. "Appreciate you holding him for us, Sheriff," the senior marshal said as they prepared to depart. "Cole Brennan's been a thorn in our side for too long." "Just doing our job," McKinnon replied, though his eyes kept drifting to his son. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd that had gathered to watch the departure, his hands clenched at his sides. Cole sat in the back of the wagon, still shackled, his pale eyes scanning the faces around him until they found Ethan's. For a moment that felt like eternity, they looked at each other across the dusty space between them. Then Cole smiled. Just a ghost of an expression, there and gone so quickly Ethan almost missed it. It was a smile that held gratitude and regret and something else. Something that made Ethan's chest tight with emotions he couldn't name. The wagon rolled away in a cloud of dust, carrying Cole Brennan toward whatever justice waited for him in Tombstone. Part 2. But it never reached Tombstone. 3 days later, as Ethan sat on the porch of the sheriff's office watching the sun sink toward the western mountains, a lone rider came up the road. The man was slumped forward in his saddle, his shirt dark with blood, his horse stumbling with exhaustion. It was one of the federal marshals. "Jesus," Ethan breathed, rushing to help the wounded man from his horse. The marshal, Patterson, Ethan remembered his name was, could barely speak through cracked lips and obvious pain. "Ambush," he managed, as Ethan helped him toward the office. 2 miles south of Copper Creek. They knew we were coming." McKinnon appeared in the doorway, took one look at the bloodied marshal, and began barking orders. "Ethan, get Doc Morrison, now." By the time the doctor arrived, Patterson had managed to tell them the rest. 6 men had hit the wagon at dawn, coming out of the rocks like ghosts. His partner was dead, their horses stolen, the wagon burned, and Cole Brennan was gone. "You see which way they went?" McKinnon asked, his voice grim. Patterson shook his head weakly. Lost consciousness. When I came to, everything was gone. Took me 2 days to walk back to where I could find a horse." McKinnon's face was stone. This wasn't random. Someone knew about the transfer. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Ethan felt his father's eyes on him, sharp and calculating, and something cold settled in his stomach. McKinnon couldn't seriously think. "I'll wire Tombstone," McKinnon said finally. "Let them know what happened. Then we'll see about organizing a pursuit." "Dad." "Sheriff McKinnon," his father corrected sharply. "And right now, I need to focus on finding 6 armed men and a federal prisoner. We'll talk later." But later, when Doc Morrison had patched up Marshal Patterson and the wounded man was sleeping in the hotel, McKinnon's questions weren't about pursuit tactics or search patterns. "You know anything about this, son?" They were standing in the sheriff's office, the lamp burning low between them. McKinnon's face was in shadow, but his voice carried the weight of 20 years of law enforcement and a lifetime of reading men's souls. "Know anything about what?" "Don't play games with me, Ethan." Someone tipped off Brennan's associates about that transfer. Someone who knew when it was happening and what route they'd take. Ethan felt heat rise in his cheeks. You think I told them? You think I'm working with outlaws? I think you've been acting strange ever since Brennan showed up in our town. I think you had feelings about that man that went beyond professional duty. And I think you're not telling me everything you know. The accusation hit Ethan like a physical blow. His own father, suspecting him of betraying everything they'd both sworn to uphold. It should have made him angry, should have sparked indignation and protest. Instead, all he felt was a hollow ache in his chest. I don't know anything about any ambush, he said quietly. And I never told anyone about the marshal's plans. McKinnon studied his face for a long moment. Maybe not, but that doesn't mean you're not involved somehow. What's that supposed to mean? It means Cole Brennan is free, 6 armed men are somewhere in my territory, and a federal marshal is lucky to be alive. And the only person in this town who showed unusual interest in the prisoner was you. Ethan turned away, staring out the window at the empty street. So what now? You going to lock me up too? Now I'm going to find Brennan and his friends before they kill anyone else. McKinnon's voice softened slightly. And you're going to stay here and think real hard about where your loyalties lie. My loyalties are with the law, son. Or they better be. The next morning, McKinnon rode out with a hastily assembled posse. 5 men from town and Marshal Patterson, still pale but determined to see justice done. They planned to start at Copper Creek and work outward, following whatever trail they could find. You stay here and mind the store, McKinnon told Ethan as he checked his rifle one final time. If anyone comes asking questions, you don't know anything about anything. How long will you be gone? However long it takes. McKinnon swung up into his saddle, his weathered face set in lines of grim determination. These men killed a federal officer, Ethan. That makes this personal. Ethan watched the posse ride out, 6 men against the endless prairie, and wondered if he'd ever see his father alive again. The weight of that possibility settled on his shoulders like a physical thing, heavy and cold and unforgiving. He spent the morning trying to lose himself in routine duties, checking the jail cells, organizing paperwork, cleaning his rifle. But his mind kept drifting to Cole Brennan, free somewhere under the vast sky, probably riding hard for Mexico or California or any of a dozen places where a wanted man could disappear forever. It was near noon when the stranger walked into the sheriff's office. He was young, maybe 18 or 19, with the kind of lean build that came from too many missed meals and too much hard living. His clothes were dusty but well kept, his gun worn with the casual ease of someone who knew how to use it. But it was his eyes that made Ethan's hand drift toward his own weapon. Pale blue eyes that seemed familiar in a way that made his chest tight. You're the deputy, the stranger said. It wasn't a question. That's right. Something I can help you with? The young man looked around the empty office, taking in the details with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to mark exits and hiding places. Name's Jake. Jake Morrison. I got a message for you. What kind of message? The kind that comes from someone you know. Someone who wanted me to tell you he's grateful for what you did? Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. I don't know what you're talking about. Jake smiled, and there was something in the expression that reminded Ethan painfully of another smile, offered from the back of a wagon 3 days ago. Sure you do, deputy. Man with pale eyes and a black horse. Quiet-spoken, polite as Sunday service. Ring any bells? Where is he? The question slipped out before Ethan could stop it, and Jake's smile widened. That's more like it. He's safe, if that's what you're worried about. Hole up in an old line cabin about 10 miles north of here. Been asking about you. About me? Wondering if you were part of the posse that rode out this morning. Seemed real concerned about that possibility. Ethan's mind was racing. Cole was alive, was safe, was asking about him, and somehow this boy, Jake, had found him, had been sent to deliver a message. What does he want? To see you. Jake's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Tonight, after full dark, follow the north road till you see a lightning-struck oak, then head east toward the hills. Can't miss the cabin. Why would he want to see me? Maybe because you're the only lawman in 3 territories who ever looked at him like he was human instead of livestock. Jake straightened, checking the street through the window. Or maybe because he's got something to tell you about that ambush. Something your daddy might want to know. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs. What kind of something? The kind you'll have to ask him about yourself. Jake moved toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. He'll wait till midnight. After that. He shrugged. After that, he's gone for good. I can't. My father left me in charge here. Your father's chasing ghosts across half the territory. Could be gone for days. Jake's pale eyes fixed on Ethan's face with uncomfortable intensity. Question is, Deputy McKinnon, you going to let this chance slip by? Or you going to find out what Cole Brennan really wants to tell you? With that, he was gone, slipping out into the afternoon heat like smoke. Ethan stood in the empty office, his hands shaking, his mind churning with possibilities and dangers and questions he couldn't answer. The rest of the day passed like a fever dream. Every hour that ticked by on the office clock felt like an eternity. Every sound from the street made him jump like a startled colt. By sunset, he'd cleaned his gun 3 times, reorganized the same stack of papers twice, and paced the floor until he was surprised he hadn't worn a groove in the wood. As full darkness settled over Mercy Ridge, Ethan found himself saddling his horse with hands that trembled despite his best efforts to control them. This was madness. Riding out to meet a wanted fugitive, leaving his post without permission, betraying everything his father had taught him about duty and honor. But Cole was waiting somewhere in the darkness, and the thought of letting midnight pass without answers was worse than the fear of what those answers might cost him. The ride north seemed to take forever. Every shadow could hide a bushwhacker. Every sound could signal an ambush. But the road remained empty except for the whisper of wind through grass and the steady rhythm of his horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth. He found the lightning-struck oak easily enough. A massive tree split down the middle by some ancient storm, its blackened trunk standing like a monument to nature's violence. From there, he turned east toward the hills, following what looked like an old game trail through brush that caught at his clothes and stones that threatened his horse's footing. The cabin was tucked into a fold in the hills, invisible from the main road but with clear sightlines in 3 directions. Smoke rose from its chimney in a thin gray line, and lamplight showed through gaps in the shuttered windows. It was the kind of place a smart outlaw would choose. Defensible, but hidden, close enough to civilization for supplies, but far enough out to avoid curious neighbors. Ethan dismounted 50 yards from the door, his hand resting on his gun. This could still be a trap. Cole could be dead, his message delivered by men who wanted to lure a naive deputy into the darkness. Or Cole could be alive and planning something that would end with another lawman's blood on his hands. But as he approached the cabin, the door opened, and Cole Brennan stepped into the lamplight. He looked different somehow, thinner maybe, with the kind of wariness that came from days of running and hiding. His clothes were clean but worn, his gun still riding low on his hip. But his eyes were the same pale blue Ethan remembered, and they fixed on his face with an intensity that made the deputy's breath catch in his throat. "You came," Cole said simply. "Your friend said you had something to tell me about the ambush. Maybe I do, or maybe I just wanted to see you again." Cole stepped back, gesturing toward the cabin's interior. "Either way, we should talk inside. Never know who might be watching." The cabin was small but comfortable, with a stone fireplace and rough-hewn furniture that spoke of careful craftsmanship. A pot of coffee sat warming by the fire, filling the air with rich aroma that made Ethan suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd eaten. "Coffee?" Cole asked, already reaching for 2 tin cups. "I shouldn't stay long." "No, I don't suppose you should." Cole poured the coffee anyway, handing 1 cup to Ethan with the same careful politeness he'd shown in the sheriff's office. "But now that you're here, we might as well talk." They sat on opposite sides of the small table, the lamp burning between them like a barrier of light against the darkness outside. Ethan found himself studying Cole's face in the flickering illumination, noting the new lines around his eyes, the way his shoulders held tension like a man expecting trouble. "Jake said you had information about the ambush," Ethan said finally. "Jake says a lot of things." Cole sipped his coffee, his eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "Most of them true, but not always in the way folks expect." "Was it you? Did you plan it?" "No." The answer came without hesitation, flat and final. "I was as surprised as anyone when those men came out of the rocks." "Then who?" Cole was quiet for a moment, studying the dark liquid in his cup. "You really want to know? Or are you just here because you feel like you need to ask?" "I want to know. Even if it changes things, even if it makes your life more complicated than it already is." Ethan met his eyes across the table. "I want to know." Cole nodded, as if he'd expected this answer. It was Marshall Patterson. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. What? Patterson set up the ambush. He's been working with outlaw gangs for months, feeding them information about prisoner transfers, bank shipments, anything that might be worth stealing. That's impossible. He was shot. He nearly died. He was grazed. Barely more than a scratch, though he played it up real good. Cole's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather. Man's got debts, deputy. Gambling debts to some very unforgiving people. Working both sides of the law was his way of staying alive. Ethan shook his head, trying to process this information. You're lying. You have to be. Am I? Think about it. How did those men know exactly when the transfer was happening? How did they know which route to take? And how did Patterson manage to survive when his partner died in the first volley? The questions hung in the air like smoke, each one building on the others until Ethan could no longer deny their logic. Patterson had been the one to suggest the southern route to Tombstone. Patterson had insisted on leaving at dawn. And Patterson had been remarkably coherent for a man who'd supposedly been unconscious for hours. Why are you telling me this? Ethan asked. Because your father is out there chasing shadows while the real villain is sleeping in your hotel? Because 6 good men are riding into danger based on lies and false information? Cole leaned forward, his pale eyes intense in the lamplight. And because you deserve to know the truth. What truth? That you're not the one who betrayed anyone, Deputy McKinnon. That whatever you're feeling about what happened between us, it doesn't make you a criminal or a traitor or anything else your conscience might be telling you. The words hit closer to home than Ethan wanted to admit. For days, he'd been wrestling with guilt and self-doubt, wondering if his feelings about Cole had somehow contributed to the ambush. The idea that Patterson, a federal marshal, a man sworn to uphold the law, had been the real betrayer was almost too much to accept. How do you know all this? He asked. Because one of the men in the ambush was my brother. The admission dropped into the silence between them like a stone into still water. Ethan stared at Cole, trying to reconcile this new information with everything he thought he knew. Your brother? Half-brother, technically. Same mother, different fathers. Jake Morrison, though Morrison isn't his real name, any more than Masters was mine. Cole's smile was tired, touched with old pain. We've been looking out for each other since we were kids. When he heard about the transfer, he came to warn me. Told me about Patterson's offer. What offer? Join the ambush. Help kill the other marshal and make it look like I was recaptured. In exchange, Patterson would report that I'd been shot trying to escape, and I'd be free to disappear. Cole shook his head. I told Jake no. I was tired of running, tired of violence. I figured whatever was waiting for me in Tombstone couldn't be worse than looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life. But you escaped anyway. Jake wouldn't listen. He organized the ambush on his own, brought in some boys I'd never seen before. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to stop it. Cole's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Marshal Hendricks died because my brother couldn't let me face justice. Now I've got his blood on my hands whether I wanted it or not. Ethan studied Cole's face in the flickering light, looking for signs of deception, but all he saw was weariness and regret, and something that looked like genuine pain. Why should I believe you? Because you're the only man I've met in 2 years who looked at me and saw something worth saving. Because when you could have arrested me on that road outside town, you let me pass. Because when you had me in shackles, you treated me like a human being instead of an animal. Cole's voice was steady, but there was something in his eyes that made Ethan's chest tight. Because I think you know deep down that I'm not the man those wanted posters make me out to be. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken things. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending smoke back down the chimney. Ethan found himself thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The first meeting on the road, the night watch at the hotel, the weight of his father's suspicion. What do you want from me? He asked finally. Nothing you can't freely give. That's not an answer. Cole was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he'd never learned to ask. When he looked up, his pale eyes held something Ethan couldn't quite name. I want you to understand that whatever happens next, you're not responsible for other men's choices. Patterson made his choice. Jake made his. Your father made his when he rode out with that posse. Cole paused, then, and you'll have to make yours. What choice? Whether to go back to town and pretend this conversation never happened, whether to arrest me and drag me back to face whatever's waiting, or whether to what? Cole met his eyes across the table. Whether to come with me. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, like a dare, like the most dangerous proposition Ethan had ever heard. Come with him. Leave everything behind. His badge, his duty, his father, his entire life, and ride out into the darkness with a wanted man whose very presence seemed to turn his world upside down. I can't, Ethan said, though his voice lacked conviction. Can't or won't? Both. Ethan stood abruptly, pacing to the window. Through the gaps in the shutters, he could see his horse waiting patiently in the darkness, ready to carry him back to safety and duty and everything he'd ever known. I'm a deputy sheriff. I have responsibilities. To who? A system that protects men like Patterson while hunting men like me? A father who suspects you of betraying everything he taught you? Cole's voice was gentle, but the questions cut deep. When's the last time you did something because you wanted to, not because someone else expected it? Ethan turned from the window to find Cole standing behind him, close enough to touch. The outlaw's pale eyes were fixed on his face with an intensity that made breathing difficult. This is crazy, Ethan whispered. Maybe. But it's also real. More real than anything else I've felt in years. You don't even know me. Don't I? Cole reached out slowly, his fingers barely brushing Ethan's cheek. The touch was soft, tentative, asking permission rather than demanding it. I know you're tired of living in your father's shadow. I know you dream about what lies beyond that horizon. I know you looked at a wanted man and saw something worth saving. Ethan closed his eyes, leaning into the touch despite every rational thought screaming at him to step away. Cole's hand was warm, calloused from years of hard living, and it cupped his face like something precious. I can't abandon my father, Ethan said, though the words came out broken. He abandoned you the moment he started suspecting you of betrayal. Cole's thumb traced across Ethan's cheekbone, the gesture so gentle it made his heart ache. How long before suspicion turns to accusation? How long before he decides you're more liability than asset? He's my father. And I'm... Cole trailed off, his hand stilling against Ethan's face. What? Ethan opened his eyes, meeting Cole's gaze. What are you? For a moment, neither of them moved. The space between them seemed charged with electricity, heavy with possibility and danger, and something neither of them had words for. Ethan could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, could hear the whisper of Cole's breathing in the lamplight. Then Cole stepped back, his hand falling away from Ethan's face. I'm a wanted man with nothing to offer but trouble, he said quietly. I'm the worst possible choice you could make. Maybe that's exactly what I need. The words slipped out before Ethan could stop them, hanging in the air like a confession. Cole stared at him, something flickering in those pale depths that might have been hope or fear or both. Don't say things you don't mean, deputy. I'm not. Ethan moved closer, drawn by something he couldn't name or resist. I've spent my whole life doing what was expected, following rules laid down by other men. Maybe it's time I made a choice for myself. And what choice is that? Ethan reached out, his fingers finding the front of Cole's shirt. The fabric was rough beneath his touch, warm with body heat and smelling of wood smoke and leather. I don't know yet. But I know I'm tired of pretending I don't feel something when I look at you. Cole's breath caught, his hands coming up to cover Ethan's. You don't know what you're saying? Don't I? Ethan could feel the rapid beating of Cole's heart beneath his palm, could see the way the outlaw's pupils had dilated in the lamplight. You felt it too, didn't you? That first night when we met on the road, something passed between us. Ethan, say it. Say you felt it too. Cole was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes searching Ethan's face as if looking for answers to questions he'd never learned to ask. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I felt it. God help me. I felt it from the moment I saw you standing there in that dusty road, hand on your gun, but looking at me like I was worth saving. The admission broke something loose in Ethan's chest, something that had been coiled tight since that first moment of recognition. Without thinking, without planning, he closed the distance between them, his mouth finding Cole's in the lamplight. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like a question neither of them was sure they wanted answered. But then Cole's hands found Ethan's face, fingers tangling in his hair, and the kiss deepened into something hungry and desperate and real. Ethan had kissed before, clumsy, fumbling with girls at church socials, careful courtship rituals that never led anywhere meaningful. But this was different. This was fire and electricity and the taste of coffee and danger on Cole's lips. This was everything he'd never known he wanted and everything he'd been afraid to reach for. When they finally broke apart, both men were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together in the flickering light. "Jesus," Ethan whispered. "Still think you don't know me?" Cole's voice was rough, strained with emotion. "I think I'm starting to." They stood there for a moment, holding each other in the lamplight, and Ethan felt something settle in his chest that he'd never experienced before, a sense of rightness, of belonging, of being exactly where he was supposed to be. Then the sound of hoofbeats drifted through the night air, distant but getting closer. Both men froze, their heads turning toward the shuttered windows. The hoofbeats were still far off, maybe a mile or more, but they were definitely moving in their direction. "Shit," Cole breathed, releasing Ethan and moving toward his gun belt. "How many men did your father take with him?" "5, plus the marshal." Ethan was already moving toward the window, peering through the gaps in the shutters. But they were heading south, not north. Maybe they doubled back. Or maybe... Cole stopped, his face going pale. "Jake, if he was watching, if he saw you right out here, he'd what? Try to protect me. Probably sent word to the boys who helped with the ambush, told them there was a deputy snooping around." Cole was strapping on his gun belt, his movements quick and efficient. "We need to go. Now." Ethan felt reality crashing back around him like cold water. The warmth of the cabin, the intimacy of the moment, the taste of Cole's lips on his, all of it suddenly seemed like a dream from which he was being roughly awakened. "Go where?" "Away from here. Those men coming, they won't care that you're a deputy. They won't care that you were just talking. All they'll see is a lawman who can identify them." "I can't run. I'm a deputy sheriff." Cole stopped, his pale eyes fixed on Ethan's face. "Then what? You want to stay here and try to explain to a gang of cutthroats why you were having coffee with the man they helped escape?" The hoofbeats were getting closer, maybe half a mile away now. Multiple horses moving fast through the darkness. Ethan's mind raced, trying to calculate distances and possibilities and chances of survival. "There's another way out of here?" he asked. "Back trail through the hills. Leads to an old mining camp about 5 miles east." Cole was already moving toward the door, blowing out the lamp as he passed. "But we need to go now before they get close enough to see the smoke from the chimney." Ethan grabbed his hat and gun belt, his hands shaking with adrenaline. Everything was happening too fast, events spiraling beyond his control like a runaway horse heading for a cliff. They slipped out the back of the cabin into the darkness, Cole leading the way toward a trail that was invisible to Ethan's eyes, but apparently clear as day to the outlaw. Their horses were waiting where they'd left them, patient and ready despite the approaching danger. "This way," Cole whispered, swinging up into his saddle. "Stay close and keep quiet. Sound carries far in these hills." They rode in single file through the darkness, Cole's black gelding picking its way along what seemed like no trail at all. Behind them, the hoofbeats grew closer, and Ethan could see the flicker of torches beginning to move toward the cabin they'd just abandoned. The trail wound through brush and over rocky ground that made their horses stumble and catch themselves. More than once, Ethan found himself gripping the saddle horn as his mount negotiated obstacles he couldn't even see in the darkness. But Cole seemed to know every stone and branch, guiding them with the confidence of a man who'd spent years learning to move unseen through hostile territory. They rode for what felt like hours but was probably less than one, the sounds of pursuit gradually fading behind them. When Cole finally called a halt, they were deep in the hills, surrounded by towering rock formations that seemed to lean in like watchers in the darkness. "We can rest here for a while," Cole said, dismounting near what looked like a natural shelter formed by fallen boulders. "Let the horses catch their breath." Ethan slid from his saddle, his legs unsteady from tension and the rough ride. The events of the last few hours seemed surreal, like something that had happened to someone else. Had he really kissed Cole Brennan? Had he really been ready to abandon everything he'd ever known? "You all right?" Cole asked, studying his face in the starlight. "I don't know." Ethan leaned against a boulder, trying to process everything that had happened. This is insane, you know that? I should be back in town doing my job, not running through the hills with a wanted man. You want to go back? The question was simple, but the weight behind it was enormous. Go back to Mercy Ridge, to his father's suspicion and Patterson's lies, and a life that suddenly seemed too small to contain everything he was feeling. I don't know, Ethan said again. Cole nodded as if this was the answer he'd expected. Fair enough. It's a lot to think about. They stood in the darkness, the horses breathing heavily nearby, the vast sky stretched out above them like a canopy of stars. Ethan found himself thinking about his father, probably still riding south with his posse, chasing phantoms while the real villain slept safely in the hotel. About Jake Morrison and whatever twisted loyalty had driven him to violence. About Marshall Patterson and the choices that had led a sworn officer to betray everything he'd taken an oath to protect. What you said about Patterson, Ethan said finally. How do I prove it? How do I make anyone believe it? You probably can't. Not without evidence, and Patterson's too smart to leave any lying around. Then what's the point of knowing? What good does it do? Cole was quiet for a moment, studying the star-filled sky. Maybe none. Or maybe it just helps you understand that the world isn't as simple as your daddy's badge makes it seem. Maybe good men sometimes do bad things, and bad men sometimes have good reasons. Is that what you are? A bad man with good reasons? I'm a man who's made choices. Some of them I'm proud of, some of them I'm not. Cole's pale eyes found Ethan's in the darkness. Same as everyone else, I suppose. Only difference is mine got me wanted posters and yours got you a badge. The truth of that statement hit Ethan like a physical blow. How many of his own choices had been real choices, and how many had been made for him by circumstance and expectation? How much of his life belonged to him, and how much to the legacy of his father's name? I keep thinking about what you said, Ethan admitted, about coming with you. And part of me wants to. Part of me wants to throw this badge in the dust and ride out of here without looking back. What about the other part? Ethan was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with thoughts and feelings he'd never had to confront before. The other part is scared. Scared of disappointing my father, scared of becoming someone I don't recognize, scared of wanting something I can't have. Cole moved closer, close enough that Ethan could feel the warmth of his body in the cool night air. What is it you want, Ethan? The question was soft, intimate, loaded with implications that made Ethan's pulse race. What did he want? Freedom from the weight of other men's expectations? The chance to see what lay beyond the horizon? The right to make choices based on his own heart instead of duty and tradition? Or something simpler and more complicated? The right to stand close to this man, to feel his presence like heat from a fire, to taste his lips in the darkness without shame or fear? I want... Ethan started, then stopped, the words catching in his throat. What? I want to not have to choose. The admission came out broken, desperate. I want to be able to care about you without betraying everything I've ever believed in. I want my father to understand. I want this whole damn situation to make sense. Cole's hand found his in the darkness, fingers intertwining with a gentleness that made Ethan's chest tight. Life doesn't work that way, Deputy. Sometimes you have to choose between what's expected and what's real. Sometimes you have to decide what kind of man you want to be. What if I choose wrong? Then you live with the consequences, same as everyone else. They stood there in the starlight, hands clasped, the weight of choice and consequence hanging between them like smoke. Around them, the hills stretched away into darkness, full of hidden dangers and unknown possibilities. Behind them, the life Ethan had always known. Ahead, something that might be freedom or might be destruction. If I came with you, Ethan said quietly, where would we go? Anywhere. California, maybe. Mexico. Plenty of places a man can lose himself if he has a mind to. And do what? Whatever we wanted. Ranch work, maybe. Or prospecting. There's still gold in those California hills if a man knows where to look. Cole's thumb traced across Ethan's knuckles, the gesture so gentle it made his heart ache. Point is, it would be our choice, our life. The word "our" hung in the air between them, heavy with promise and possibility. Our life, our choices, our future, whatever that might hold. I can't, Ethan whispered, though the words felt like they were being torn from his chest. I can't just abandon everything. Cole nodded, his grip on Ethan's hand tightening briefly before he let go. I know. I knew it when I asked, but I had to... I had to let you know the offer was there. Cole, it's all right, Ethan. I understand. You've got responsibilities, people depending on you. I can't ask you to throw that away for something as uncertain as this. But as Cole stepped back, putting distance between them, Ethan felt something tear inside his chest. The space between them seemed to open like a wound, cold and empty and wrong. What will you do? Ethan asked. What I've always done. Keep moving. Stay ahead of the law long enough to find somewhere safe. Cole's smile was tired, touched with old pain. Maybe I'll make it to California after all. Maybe I'll find that new life I keep telling myself is possible. And if you don't, then I suppose I'll face whatever comes. Same as any man. The resignation in Cole's voice made something twist in Ethan's gut. This was wrong, all of it. A good man forced to run for crimes that weren't entirely his fault, while corrupt officials like Patterson slept safely in clean beds. A system that protected the guilty and hunted the innocent, as long as the innocent didn't have money or influence or the right friends in the right places. There has to be another way, Ethan said. Like what? I don't know, but there has to be something better than you running for the rest of your life while men like Patterson get away with murder. Cole's laugh held no humor. Justice, you mean? The kind that comes from courts and judges and due process? Why not? Because I'm a wanted man with a price on my head and a reputation that makes folks cross the street when they see me coming. Because Patterson's a federal marshal with 20 years of service and a wound that makes him look like a hero. Cole shook his head. Your faith in the system is admirable, Deputy, but it's also naive. Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to insist that truth would out and justice would prevail. All the things his father had taught him about how the world was supposed to work. But standing there in the darkness, holding hands with a man the law considered a criminal, those certainties felt as fragile as glass. So what now? He asked. Now you go home. Tell your father you couldn't sleep, went for a ride to clear your head. Act surprised when Patterson's treachery eventually comes to light. And it will. Eventually. Men like him always get too greedy, make too many mistakes. And you? I disappear. Again. Cole looked up at the star-filled sky, his profile sharp in the pale light. Maybe this time for good. The finality in his voice made Ethan's chest tight. After tonight, he might never see Cole again. This moment, this connection between them, might be all they ever had. I wish things were different, Ethan said quietly. So do I. Cole's pale eyes found his in the darkness. But wishing doesn't change what is. They stood in silence for a while, the weight of unspoken things heavy between them. Ethan found himself memorizing details, the way starlight caught in Cole's dark hair, the line of his jaw, the careful way he held himself even in moments of apparent rest. All of it would have to last, whatever came next. We should probably start back, Cole said finally. Those riders might still be looking, and Dawn's not that far off. Ethan nodded, though every fiber in his being rebelled against the idea of movement, of action, of anything that brought this moment closer to its inevitable end. But Cole was right. They couldn't stay hidden in the hills forever, and Ethan's absence from town would eventually be noticed. They rode back through the darkness in silence, retracing their path through brush and stone. The pursuit seemed to have given up or moved on. There were no sounds of horses or voices echoing through the hills. But both men remained alert, hands near their weapons, eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger. It was nearly dawn when they reached the outskirts of Mercy Ridge. The town was still dark and quiet, most folks sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that their deputy sheriff had spent the night in the company of a wanted outlaw. This is where we part ways, Cole said, pulling up near the same lightning-struck oak where their journey had begun. Ethan stopped beside him, suddenly desperate to find words for everything he was feeling. But what could he say? That he was falling for a man he barely knew? That he wanted to abandon everything he'd ever been taught was right and good? That the taste of Cole's lips had awakened something in him that he'd never even known existed? Cole, I don't. Cole's voice was gentle but firm. Don't make this harder than it already is. They sat on their horses in the pre-dawn darkness, two men separated by law and duty and circumstances beyond their control. Ethan could feel his heart breaking in ways he hadn't known were possible, could feel something precious slipping through his fingers like water. Will I see you again? He asked. Cole was quiet for a long moment, his pale eyes studying Ethan's face as if trying to memorize it. "I hope not," he said finally. "For your sake, I hope not." Then he was gone, spurring his black gelding into the darkness, disappearing like smoke into the vast emptiness of the prairie. Ethan sat alone beside the lightning-struck tree, watching the horizon swallow the only thing that had ever made him feel truly alive. He made it back to the sheriff's office just as the first light of dawn touched the eastern mountains. His horse was lathered with sweat and exhaustion, and Ethan himself felt like he'd been through a war. But he unsaddled and brushed down his mount with mechanical precision, then made his way to the small house behind the office where he'd grown up. Coffee. He needed coffee and time to think, and maybe a way to make sense of everything that had happened. But as he pushed through the front door, he found his father sitting at the kitchen table, rifle across his knees, eyes as cold as winter sky. "Have a good ride, son?" Ethan's blood turned to ice in his veins. "Dad, I thought you were with the posse?" "I was. Until Jake Morrison rode into our camp last night with a very interesting story." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Ethan gripped the doorframe, his mind racing through possibilities and explanations and desperate lies. But his father's expression told him none of them would work. "What kind of story?" "The kind that involves my son riding out in the middle of the night to meet with a wanted fugitive. The kind that makes me wonder if I know you at all." McKinnon rose from his chair, the rifle never wavering from ready position. It wasn't aimed at Ethan, not exactly, but the threat was clear enough. "Where is he, Ethan?" "Who? Don't play games with me, boy." "Cole Brennan." "Where is he?" Ethan straightened, drawing what dignity he could around himself like armor. "I don't know." "You're lying." "I'm telling you the truth. I don't know where he is now." McKinnon's eyes narrowed, studying his son's face with 20 years of experience reading men's souls. "But you saw him. You talked to him." There was no point in denying it. Jake had already told his father everything, probably in exchange for some consideration for his own crimes. "Yes, I saw him." "And? And what? And what did he tell you? What did he offer you? Money? Freedom? A chance to be someone other than Robert McKinnon's son?" The last question hit closer to home than Ethan wanted to admit, but he kept his voice steady, his eyes on his father's face. "He told me about Patterson." McKinnon's expression didn't change. "What about Patterson?" "That he's the one who set up the ambush. That he's been working with outlaw gangs, feeding them information in exchange for money." "And you believed him?" "Yes." "Why?" Ethan thought about Cole's voice in the lamplight, the pain in his pale eyes when he talked about his brother's misguided loyalty. The way he'd held himself like a man carrying guilt that wasn't entirely his to bear. "Because he had no reason to lie to me." McKinnon was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Maybe he did. Maybe he didn't." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" "The point is that you met with a wanted fugitive without informing your superior officer. The point is that you had information about a federal prisoner and kept it to yourself. The point is that you've forgotten which side of the law you're supposed to be on." Each accusation hit like a physical blow. Ethan wanted to defend himself, wanted to explain about recognition and connection, and the way Cole's touch had made him feel like he was finally waking up from a long sleep. But how could he make his father understand something he barely understood himself? "I didn't do anything wrong," he said finally. "Didn't you?" McKinnon moved closer, his weathered face hard as stone. "Then why does it feel like I don't know you anymore? Why does it feel like I'm looking at a stranger wearing my son's face?" The words cut deeper than any knife. Ethan felt something break inside his chest, something that might have been the last of his childhood innocence or the first recognition that he was no longer the boy his father had raised. "Maybe because I'm not that boy anymore," he said quietly. McKinnon's face went through several expressions: surprise, pain, something that might have been grief. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I've seen things, learned things that don't fit with everything you taught me about right and wrong. It means the world isn't as simple as you made it seem. The world is exactly as simple as I made it seem. There's law and there's chaos. There's order and there's anarchy. There's right and there's wrong." McKinnon's voice rose with each word, 20 years of certainty and conviction pouring out. "And there's loyalty, son. Loyalty to family, to duty, to everything that makes us better than the animals. What about loyalty to truth? What about loyalty to justice, even when it's not convenient? What about loyalty to me? The question came out raw, desperate. What about loyalty to the man who raised you, who taught you everything you know, who trusted you with his name and his reputation? Ethan felt tears prick at his eyes, though he refused to let them fall. I never betrayed you, Dad. I never betrayed anything you taught me that was worth keeping. Then why does it feel like I've lost you? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with years of shared history and love and expectations that neither of them knew how to navigate. Ethan looked at his father, really looked at him, and saw not the towering figure of authority he'd grown up fearing and admiring, but a man approaching 60 who'd built his whole identity around being right, being strong, being the kind of father his son could be proud of. You haven't lost me, Ethan said softly. But you might have to accept that I'm not going to be exactly the man you wanted me to be. McKinnon stared at him for a long moment, the rifle still across his knees, his weathered face cycling through emotions Ethan couldn't read. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired. Are you going to tell me where Brennan is? I told you. I don't know. Are you going to tell me what he said about Patterson? I already did. Are you going to take off that badge and walk away from everything we've built here? The question was the one Ethan had been dreading, the one that cut to the heart of everything he'd been wrestling with since that first moment of recognition on the dusty road outside town. I don't know, he said honestly. McKinnon nodded, as if this was the answer he'd expected. Well, until you figure it out, you're suspended. Badge and gun, on the table. Ethan stared at his father, feeling something cold settle in his stomach. You're suspending me? I'm protecting you. From yourself, from the consequences of whatever's got into your head, from questions I can't answer and accusations I can't defend against. Dad, it's temporary, son. Until this business with Brennan gets sorted out, until I can figure out what really happened with that ambush, until you remember where your loyalties lie. McKinnon's voice softened slightly. But right now, I can't trust you to do your job. And if I can't trust you, how can I ask anyone else to? Ethan unbuckled his gun belt with hands that trembled despite his efforts to control them. The weight of it, gun and badge, and everything they represented suddenly seemed enormous. He set them on the table between him and his father, the metal making a sound like a death knell in the morning quiet. There, he said. Happy now? No, son. I'm not happy at all. McKinnon picked up the badge, turning it over in his weathered hands. The morning light caught the metal, sending reflections dancing across the kitchen walls. 20 years I've carried one of these, he said quietly. 20 years of trying to make this corner of the world a little bit safer, a little bit more just. Your mother used to say I cared more about that badge than I did about her. Did you? McKinnon was quiet for a long moment, staring at the badge like it held answers to questions he'd never learned to ask. I thought I was caring about both. I thought doing right by the law meant doing right by everyone I loved. Maybe I was wrong about that. Dad, go get some rest, Ethan. We'll talk more later when tempers have cooled and heads are clearer. Ethan nodded and turned to go, then stopped in the doorway. What are you going to do about Patterson? My job, same as always, even if Cole was telling the truth? Especially if he was telling the truth. McKinnon's eyes were hard again, the moment of vulnerability passed. If Patterson's dirty, he'll answer for it, but he'll answer to the law, not to vigilante justice from wanted men and lovesick deputies. The words hit like a slap. Ethan felt heat rise in his cheeks, felt anger and shame, and something like relief all tangled together in his chest. Is that what you think this is? Some kind of infatuation? I think you're 22 years old and you've never been tested the way you were tested last week. I think Cole Brennan is exactly the kind of man who could turn a good boy's head, make him forget everything he's ever been taught about right and wrong. You don't know anything about it. Don't I? McKinnon stood, moving to the window that looked out toward the road where Ethan had first encountered Cole. I was young once too, son. I know what it feels like to want something you can't have, to be drawn to something that could destroy everything you've worked for. There was something in his father's voice, some old pain or regret that made Ethan look at him with new eyes. What are you talking about? McKinnon was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the empty road. Your mother wasn't the first woman I loved. Before her, there was someone else. Someone I couldn't have, shouldn't have wanted. What happened? I made a choice. I chose duty over desire. responsibility over passion. I chose to be the kind of man this town needed instead of the kind of man I might have wanted to be. Do you regret it? McKinnon turned from the window, his weathered face showing every one of his nearly 60 years. Every day. But I also know it was the right choice, even if it wasn't the easy one. Some things are more important than what we want, son. Some things matter more than our personal happiness. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and old pain and the weight of choices made and unmade. Ethan looked at his father and saw not just the sheriff of Mercy Ridge, but a man who'd sacrificed his own dreams for duty and honor and the needs of others. I'm not you, Ethan said quietly. No, you're not. The question is, what kind of man are you going to be? Before Ethan could answer, the sound of hoofbeats drifted through the morning air. Both men turned toward the window, where a single rider was approaching fast from the south. As he drew closer, they could see it was Tom Bradley, one of the men who'd ridden out with the posse. Trouble, McKinnon muttered, grabbing his hat and rifle. They met Tom in the street, where the exhausted cowboy was sliding from his lathered horse with the kind of urgency that meant bad news. Sheriff, Tom gasped, barely able to catch his breath. You need to come quick. What happened? Found the gang. Holed up in Devil's Canyon, maybe 15 miles south of here. But they saw us coming, started shooting before we could get close. McKinnon's face went grim. Anyone hurt? Patterson took a bullet in the shoulder, but he'll live. Problem is, we're outnumbered. Maybe 6 or 7 of them, all armed and in good cover. We need more men if we're going to root them out. How many more? As many as you can round up? This isn't going to be easy. McKinnon was already moving, his mind calculating distances and possibilities and tactical necessities. Ethan, go wake up Mayor Carson. Tell him we need volunteers, armed and mounted, ready to ride within the hour. Dad, I'm suspended, remember? McKinnon stopped, turning to look at his son. For a moment, something passed between them. Recognition of need, of duty that transcended personal conflict, of the bonds that held them together despite everything else. Right now, you're a citizen of Mercy Ridge, McKinnon said finally, and this town needs every man who can sit a horse and shoot straight. Ethan nodded and ran toward the mayor's house, his mind racing. 6 or 7 armed men in Devil's Canyon, with his father's small posse pinned down and outnumbered. It would be a slaughter if they tried to take them without reinforcements. But as he pounded on Mayor Carson's door, another thought crept into his mind. Cole had talked about his brother Jake, about the boys Jake had recruited for the ambush. 6 or 7 men, all armed, all desperate enough to shoot at federal marshals. What if the gang in Devil's Canyon wasn't just any group of outlaws? What if it was Jake Morrison and his associates making their last stand before trying to escape into Mexico? And what if Cole was with them? The thought made Ethan's blood run cold. His father was planning to ride out with a hastily assembled posse to attack a fortified position held by desperate men. Men who would shoot to kill, who had nothing left to lose. Men who might include the only person who'd ever made Ethan feel like he was more than just Robert McKinnon's son. Mayor Carson answered the door in his night clothes, listened to Ethan's rushed explanation, and immediately began organizing the town's response. Within minutes, church bells were ringing to summon volunteers, and men were stumbling from their houses with rifles and revolvers and whatever ammunition they could find. But as the impromptu posse gathered in the street, Ethan found himself thinking not about tactics or firepower or the chances of success. He was thinking about pale blue eyes and gentle hands and the taste of coffee and danger in the darkness. He was thinking about choice and consequence and the kind of man he wanted to be. And he was thinking about time running out like water through his fingers. Mount up, McKinnon called, swinging into his own saddle. We ride hard and we ride fast. These men have already killed 1 federal officer. Let's make sure they don't kill any more. Size. The posse thundered out of Mercy Ridge in a cloud of dust and determination. 15 men armed with righteous anger and the absolute certainty that they were on the side of justice. Ethan rode near the back, officially just another volunteer, but his mind was elsewhere. Somewhere ahead, in a canyon that had earned its name from the bones of men who'd died there, a confrontation was building that would decide more than just the fate of a gang of outlaws. It would decide who lived and who died, who was vindicated and who was condemned. It would decide what kind of man Deputy Ethan McKinnon, or former deputy, depending on how things went, was going to become. As they rode south toward Devil's Canyon, The sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, and somewhere in the distance, gunfire echoed like thunder across the empty prairie. The final act was beginning. Devil's Canyon was well named. It was a slash in the earth about a mile long and maybe 200 yards wide at its mouth, narrowing to barely 50 yards at its far end. Steep walls of red rock rose on both sides, creating perfect cover for anyone foolish or desperate enough to make a stand there. But those same walls also created a trap. There was only one way in and one way out, and both were easily watched. McKinnon called a halt about half a mile from the canyon mouth, gathering his men in the shelter of a low ridge where they could observe without being seen. The original posse was still there, taking cover behind rocks and keeping the outlaws pinned down with sporadic rifle fire. But it was a standoff. Neither side could advance without taking heavy casualties. "Tom," McKinnon called to the exhausted cowboy who'd brought word to town. "What's the situation?" "They're holed up about halfway back, where the canyon narrows. Good cover, clean water from a spring, probably enough supplies to last a week if they're careful." Tom wiped sweat from his face with a grimy sleeve. "Patterson thinks maybe we should try to wait them out, starve them into surrender." "And what do you think?" "I think desperate men do desperate things. We wait too long. They might try to shoot their way out, or they might decide to make us pay in blood for every inch." McKinnon nodded grimly. He'd fought in the war between the states, had seen what desperate men could do when backed into a corner. It was never pretty, and it was never clean. How many of them, for certain? Hard to say. We counted at least 6 different rifles, maybe 7. Could be more. "Any idea who they are?" Tom shrugged. "Outlaws? That's all we need to know." But Ethan knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing about this situation was simple. From Patterson's treachery to Jake Morrison's misguided loyalty to the choice Ethan had made to let Cole ride away into the darkness. Everything was connected, all of it leading to this moment when good men and bad would bleed together on the hard ground of Devil's Canyon. "I'm going to get closer," McKinnon announced, checking his rifle. "See if I can get a better idea of what we're dealing with." "Dad, that's not—" Ethan started, then caught himself. He wasn't a deputy anymore, had no official standing to question his father's decisions. "Not what?" McKinnon's eyes were hard, challenging. "Not safe. If they've got the high ground and good cover, then I'll be careful." McKinnon's tone brooked no argument. "But I need to see the situation for myself before I risk good men's lives on someone else's assessment." He moved off toward the canyon, using every scrap of cover the broken ground provided. Ethan watched him go, his heart in his throat, remembering suddenly how much older his father had looked that morning. Nearly 60, with gray in his hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many years carrying other people's burdens. "He'll be all right," Mayor Carson said quietly, appearing at Ethan's elbow. "Your daddy's been at this longer than any of us. He knows what he's doing." "I know." But Ethan's voice lacked conviction. He'd seen too much in the last few days, learned too much about the gap between what people believed and what was actually true. His father might know law enforcement, but did he know betrayal? Did he understand the kind of desperation that drove men to violence? Did he have any idea that his son was more concerned about the men in that canyon than the men he'd ridden out to save? A rifle shot echoed from the direction of the canyon, then another. Shouts drifted on the hot air, though the words were impossible to make out at this distance. Ethan found himself gripping his reins so hard his knuckles had gone white. "Easy, boy," one of the other volunteers said. Pete from the hotel, his weathered face kind but concerned. "Sheriff knows what he's about?" But 20 minutes passed without any sign of McKinnon's return, and the sporadic gunfire from the canyon continued. Finally, when Ethan couldn't stand the waiting anymore, he slipped from his horse and began working his way toward the canyon mouth, using the same careful approach his father had taken. He found McKinnon crouched behind a boulder about 200 yards from where the shooting was taking place, studying the scene through a pair of field glasses. The older man looked up as Ethan approached, his expression cycling through surprise, annoyance, and something that might have been relief. "What the hell are you doing here?" McKinnon whispered, "watching your back. You're not a deputy anymore, remember? I'm still your son." McKinnon stared at him for a moment, then handed over the field glasses. "Take a look. Tell me what you see." Ethan focused the glasses on the canyon walls, scanning slowly from left to right. The outlaws had chosen their position well, a natural amphitheater where the canyon walls came together, creating crossfire opportunities and multiple angles of cover. He could see muzzle flashes from at least 5 different positions, confirming Tom's estimate of the enemy's strength. But it was the 6th position that made his blood run cold. High up on the left wall, partially hidden by an overhang of rock, a lone figure was visible for just a moment as he shifted position. Dark hair, lean build, the careful movements of someone who knew how to stay alive in impossible situations. Cole, well? McKinnon prompted. Ethan lowered the glasses, his mind racing. Cole was there, trapped with Jake Morrison, and whatever other men had been drawn into this final desperate gambit. In a few hours, when the sun got low enough to eliminate the defender's advantage, his father would order an attack. Men would die, probably men on both sides, including, very possibly, the man whose lips Ethan could still taste in his memory. 6 or 7 men, Ethan said carefully. Good positions, plenty of ammunition. It won't be easy to root them out. But it can be done? Maybe, if you're willing to pay the price. McKinnon nodded grimly. Sometimes that's what the job requires. They worked their way back to where the rest of the posse waited, and McKinnon began organizing his assault. The plan was simple. Wait until late afternoon when the sun would be in the defender's eyes. Then attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Dangerous, bloody, but probably effective. We'll hit them from 3 sides, McKinnon explained, sketching positions in the dirt with a stick. Tom, you take 5 men and work around to the north wall. Pete, take 3 and cover the south approach. I'll take the rest straight up the middle. What about me? Ethan asked. McKinnon looked at him for a long moment. You're not officially part of this operation. Unofficially? Unofficially, you stay here and make sure our horses don't wander off. The dismissal stung, but Ethan understood it. His father didn't trust him anymore, couldn't be sure whose side he was really on. And honestly, McKinnon was right to be suspicious. Because as Ethan sat there listening to plans for an assault that could kill Cole Brennan, he found himself thinking not about justice or duty, but about how he might warn the men in the canyon. About how he might save the only person who'd ever made him feel truly alive. The afternoon wore on with agonizing slowness. The sun climbed toward its zenith, then began its slow descent toward the western mountains. The posse checked weapons, redistributed ammunition, and tried to stay calm in the face of approaching violence. But Ethan's mind was elsewhere, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. What did he owe his father? What did he owe the law? What did he owe Cole and Jake Morrison and the other men who were about to die for choices they'd made in desperation? And what did he owe himself? As the sun sank lower, painting the canyon walls in shades of red and gold, McKinnon began moving his men into position. This was it. The moment when planning became action, when words became bullets, when the philosophical became brutally real. Remember, McKinnon called softly to his scattered volunteers, these men are dangerous. They've already killed a federal officer. Don't give them any chances they wouldn't give you. Ethan watched his father disappear into the rocks, leading his portion of the assault force toward the canyon mouth. In a few minutes, shooting would begin. In a few minutes, everything would change forever. He could stay here, hold the horses, let events unfold according to his father's plan. Cole would live or die based on chance and skill, and whatever gods watched over wanted men. Ethan would remain clean, uninvolved, his hands free of blood and his conscience clear. Or, the thought that had been building all afternoon finally crystallized into decision. Ethan swung into his saddle and spurred his horse toward the canyon, taking a route that would bring him to the north wall ahead of Tom's flanking force. If he was going to betray everything he'd ever been taught, he might as well do it properly. The approach to Devil's Canyon was treacherous. Loose rock that could betray a horse's footing, brush that caught at stirrups and sleeves, the constant danger of being spotted by lookouts on either side. But Ethan had grown up in this country, had spent his boyhood exploring every hidden trail and secret passage within 50 miles of Mercy Ridge. He knew a way in that most folks had forgotten about. The old mine shaft had been abandoned for 20 years, its entrance hidden by rockfall and overgrown with brush. But Ethan remembered exploring it as a boy, remembered the way it wound through the canyon wall to emerge behind a screen of boulders near the spring where the outlaws had made their camp. It took him 10 minutes to work his way through the cramped passage, crawling on hands and knees through spaces barely wide enough for a grown man. When he finally emerged, dusty and scraped, he found himself looking down at the outlaw camp from about 30 feet above. They were all there, Jake Morrison, pale and tense, directing the placement of riflemen along the canyon walls. Four other men Ethan didn't recognize, hard-faced and desperate, checking their weapons with the methodical care of professionals, and Cole standing apart from the others, his pale eyes scanning the canyon mouth where he knew attack would come. "Cole," Ethan called softly. The outlaw spun, his hand dropping to his gun before he recognized the voice. His face went through several expressions: surprise, concern, something that might have been hope. "Ethan? What the hell are you doing here? Warning you, my father's got 15 men positioned around this canyon. They're going to attack in about 10 minutes. Jake Morrison had heard his voice and was climbing toward Ethan's position, his young face hard with suspicion. "It's a trap," he told Cole. "Has to be." "No trap," Ethan said, though he kept his hands visible and made no sudden moves. "But you need to know what you're facing." "Why?" Jake's rifle was trained on Ethan now, his finger on the trigger. "Why would a deputy sheriff warn us about anything?" Ethan looked past Jake to Cole, who was watching this exchange with those unsettling pale eyes. "Because sometimes a man has to choose between what's legal and what's right." Cole smiled, the same ghost of an expression Ethan remembered from their night in the cabin. "Told you those words would come back to haunt you." "Maybe they should." Ethan scrambled down from his perch, sliding and jumping until he reached the canyon floor. "But right now, you need to get out of here. There's a passage through the north wall, about 50 yards back. It's narrow, but it'll get you out before the shooting starts." Jake was shaking his head, his rifle still trained on Ethan. "I don't trust him, Cole. This smells like a setup." "If it was a setup, would I be here alone?" Ethan spread his hands, showing he was unarmed. "Would I have risked everything to warn you? Maybe, if the price was right." "What price could be worth this?" Jake's pale eyes, so much like his brother's, Ethan realized, studied his face with uncomfortable intensity. "Maybe you're sweet on him. Maybe you figure saving his life will get you something in return." The accusation hit closer to home than Ethan wanted to admit. But before he could respond, Cole stepped forward, putting himself between his brother and the deputy. "That's enough, Jake." "Is it? This whole thing stinks, Cole. First he lets you go free in town, then he shows up at the cabin for a cozy chat, now he's here playing savior. What's his angle? Maybe he doesn't have one. Maybe he's just doing what he thinks is right. Nobody does what's right when it costs them everything. Not unless they're getting something better in return." The cynicism in Jake's voice made Ethan's chest tight. Here was a boy barely out of his teens, already so hardened by life that he couldn't believe in simple decency or human kindness. How many other young men had the world broken before they'd even had a chance to discover who they might have been? "You're wrong," Ethan said quietly. "Sometimes people do the right thing just because it's right. Sometimes that has to be enough." Jake laughed harshly. "Pretty words from a man wearing a badge." "I'm not wearing a badge." Ethan touched his chest where the star had rested for 2 years. "Got suspended this morning for talking to your brother." That seemed to give Jake pause. He glanced at Cole, who nodded confirmation. "His daddy didn't take kindly to unauthorized meetings with wanted fugitives," Cole explained. "Figured it showed divided loyalties." "Did it?" Jake's rifle was still ready, but his finger had moved away from the trigger. Ethan looked at Cole, then back at Jake. "Yeah, I guess it did." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and raw and dangerous. Around them, the other outlaws had stopped what they were doing to listen, their faces showing various degrees of suspicion and interest. "So what now?" one of them asked, a grizzled man with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw. "We trust the deputy? Or do we plug him and keep fighting?" "We get out of here," Cole said firmly. "All of us, before the shooting starts." "Through that passage he mentioned?" Jake's voice was still skeptical, but Ethan could hear the desperation underneath. These men knew they were trapped, knew their chances of surviving a frontal assault were slim at best. "It's real," Ethan said. "Old mining tunnel. Comes out about half a mile north of here near Devil's Creek. You could be in Mexico in 3 days if you ride hard." "And you?" Cole's pale eyes fixed on Ethan's face. "What happens to you when your father finds out what you've done?" Ethan had been trying not to think about that. Aiding and abetting wanted fugitives, interfering with a lawful arrest, betraying everything his father had raised him to believe in. There would be consequences, legal ones, personal ones, consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. I'll figure something out. Will you? Cole moved closer, close enough that Ethan could see the concern in those pale depths. They'll call you an outlaw too, you know. Once word gets out that you helped us escape, maybe that's what I am. The words slipped out before Ethan could stop them, surprising him with their truth. Maybe he was an outlaw, someone who'd chosen his own sense of justice over the law's definition of it, someone who'd decided that human decency mattered more than badges and regulations. Jesus, Jake breathed. You're serious, aren't you? You're really willing to throw away everything for us? Not for you, Ethan said, looking directly at Cole. For him. The admission hung in the air like smoke, honest and dangerous and impossible to take back. Around them, the other outlaws shifted uncomfortably, recognizing something they couldn't quite name but instinctively understood. Well, I'll be damned, the scarred man muttered. Deputy's gone and fallen in love with our Cole. Shut up, Briggs, Jake snapped, but his pale eyes were studying Ethan with new interest. Is that what this is? You figure saving us will get you into Cole's good graces? I figure saving you might keep a good man from dying for someone else's mistakes, Ethan replied. What happens after that? We'll see. Cole was watching this exchange with an expression Ethan couldn't read. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, barely audible over the wind through the canyon. Show us this passage. They moved quickly but quietly, gathering what supplies they could carry and abandoning everything else. The spring would keep running, the canyon walls would keep standing, but in a few minutes this place would be full of gunfire and blood and the kind of violence that left permanent scars on everyone it touched. The passage was exactly where Ethan had said it would be, hidden behind a fall of rocks that looked natural but had been carefully arranged by long-dead miners. One by one, the outlaws squeezed through the narrow opening, disappearing into the darkness beyond. Jake went first, still suspicious but pragmatic enough to take salvation when it was offered. Then the others, Briggs and the rest, hard men who'd probably never expected to owe their lives to a deputy sheriff. Finally, only Cole remained, standing at the passage entrance with his pale eyes fixed on Ethan's face. You're not coming, he said. It wasn't a question. Can't. Someone has to stay, make it look like you were here when the attack started. Otherwise, my father will know what really happened. And then? Ethan shrugged, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. Then I'll think of something. Maybe claim I got knocked unconscious during the fighting. Didn't see which way you went? That won't work? There'll be an investigation, questions, people trying to figure out how 6 armed men disappeared from a sealed canyon. Maybe, but it might buy you enough time to get clear. Cole stepped closer, close enough that Ethan could feel the heat of his body, could see the flecks of gold in those pale eyes. Come with me. Cole, I'm serious. Right now, this minute, before it's too late. We can be through that passage and gone before your father even realizes what's happened. The offer hung between them, tempting as sin and twice as dangerous. Ethan could picture it, riding out into the endless prairie with Cole beside him, leaving behind everything that had ever constrained or limited or disappointed him. No more living in his father's shadow, no more pretending to be something he wasn't, no more choosing between duty and desire. But he could also picture what would happen to his father when 15 volunteers rode into this canyon expecting a fight and found nothing but empty air and unanswered questions. McKinnon would be disgraced, his reputation destroyed, his life's work reduced to a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting your own blood. I can't, Ethan said, though the words felt like they were being torn from his chest. Not like this, not with him thinking I betrayed everything he ever taught me. Haven't you? The question was gentle but merciless. Ethan looked into Cole's eyes and saw his own reflection, a man standing at the crossroads between everything he'd been and everything he might become. Maybe, but I need him to understand why. Cole nodded, as if he'd expected this answer. And if he doesn't? If he decides you're beyond redemption? Then I guess I'll have to live with that. Or die with it. The words were soft, almost whispered, but they carried the weight of absolute truth. What Ethan was contemplating, staying behind to face the consequences of his choices, might very well be a death sentence. His father's posse would be expecting a fight, would be keyed up for violence. When they found an empty canyon and started asking questions, the answers might not be kind to anyone caught in the crossfire. Maybe, Ethan agreed, but some things are worth dying for. Are they? Cole's hand found Ethan's face, fingers tracing the line of his jaw with heartbreaking gentleness. Is duty worth dying for? Is your father's approval worth more than your life? I don't know, but I know running away won't answer those questions. Cole stared at him for a long moment, his pale eyes reflecting something that might have been admiration or might have been grief. Then, without warning, he leaned forward and kissed him. It was different from their first kiss in the cabin. Harder, more desperate, tinged with the knowledge that this might be the last time their lips ever touched. Ethan could taste salt, could feel Cole's hands trembling against his face, could hear his own heart hammering like thunder in the canyon silence. When they broke apart, both men were breathing hard. I love you, Cole said simply. I know it's crazy. I know we barely know each other, but I love you and I don't want to lose you. The words hit Ethan like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and making his vision swim. Love. Cole loved him. This man who could have anyone, who could disappear into the vastness of the American frontier and start over anywhere he chose, loved him. Cole, don't say anything. Just remember that, whatever happens, remember that someone loved you enough to want you to live. Then Cole was gone, disappearing into the passage like smoke, leaving Ethan alone in the canyon with the weight of choice and consequence and the taste of goodbye on his lips. He didn't have long to wait. The attack came from 3 directions simultaneously, just as McKinnon had planned. Rifle fire echoed from the canyon walls as the posse advanced, expecting resistance, expecting to flush desperate men from their hiding places like quail from cover. Instead, they found emptiness. Ethan had positioned himself near the spring, close enough to the outlaw's former positions to make his presence plausible, but far enough from the passage to avoid suspicion. When the shooting started, he fired his own rifle into the air a few times, then threw himself behind a boulder and waited for the inevitable. It took McKinnon's men about 10 minutes to realize they were shooting at shadows. When the firing finally stopped and the echoes faded, an eerie quiet settled over Devil's Canyon. Ethan could hear his father's voice, sharp with confusion and growing anger, calling for his men to advance and search every hiding place. They're gone, Tom Bradley announced after several minutes of fruitless searching. Every last one of them. That's impossible, McKinnon's voice carried clearly in the canyon air. There's only one way out of here and we had it watched. Well, they ain't here now. Ethan waited until he heard his father's boots on the rocky ground nearby, then called out weakly, Sheriff? That you? McKinnon appeared around the boulder where Ethan was hiding, his weathered face cycling through relief, concern, and suspicion in rapid succession. Ethan? What the hell are you doing here? Heard the shooting, Ethan mumbled, trying to look dazed. Came to help, then something hit me in the head. He gestured vaguely toward a loose rock that could plausibly have been dislodged by gunfire. You see which way they went? Ethan blinked slowly, as if trying to focus. Who? The outlaws, son. The men who were holed up here. No, I was unconscious. Just came to a few minutes ago. McKinnon's eyes narrowed, studying his son's face with uncomfortable intensity. You just happened to be here when the shooting started? You just happened to get knocked unconscious at the exact moment 6 armed men vanished into thin air. I guess so. You guess so. McKinnon's voice was flat, dangerous. That's a hell of a lot of coincidences, don't you think? Ethan met his father's eyes, trying to project innocence and confusion. But he could see the suspicion there, the growing certainty that nothing about this situation was what it seemed. I don't know what you want me to say, Dad. I came here to help, and I got knocked cold for my trouble. That's all I remember. McKinnon stared at him for another long moment, then turned away to survey the empty canyon. His men were still searching, still hoping to find some clue about how 6 desperate outlaws had simply disappeared from a supposedly sealed trap. Sir? Tom Bradley appeared at McKinnon's elbow, his face grim. Found something you need to see. They followed Tom to the back of the canyon, where the rocks had been carefully arranged to hide the passage entrance. Someone had tried to conceal the opening after the outlaws passed through, but there were still clear signs of recent disturbance, scuff marks on the stone, a piece of torn cloth caught on a sharp edge. Son of a bitch, McKinnon breathed. There's another way out? Looks like it goes clear through the canyon wall, Tom confirmed. Could come out anywhere within a mile or two of here. McKinnon's face was stone as he turned back to Ethan. You know anything about this passage, son? The moment of truth had arrived. Ethan could continue lying, could claim ignorance and hope his father's suspicions never hardened into certainty. Or he could tell the truth and face whatever consequences that brought. He thought about Cole's words. Sometimes you have to choose between what's legal and what's right. He thought about Jake Morrison's cynicism, his inability to believe that anyone would do the right thing without expecting something in return. He thought about his father, standing there with 20 years of law enforcement experience and the growing certainty that his own son had betrayed everything they'd both sworn to uphold. Yeah, Ethan said quietly, I know about it. The admission hit the assembled men like a thunderclap. McKinnon's face went through several expressions, surprise, pain, something that might have been grief, before settling into a mask of professional calm. You know about it? Yeah. And? And I told them about it. The silence that followed was deafening. 15 armed men, all staring at the deputy sheriff who'd just confessed to aiding and abetting wanted fugitives. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, could feel sweat trickling down his back despite the cool air in the canyon. Why? McKinnon's voice was barely above a whisper. Because it was the right thing to do. The right thing? McKinnon's composure finally cracked, 20 years of controlled emotion pouring out in a torrent of words. The right thing was to help 6 armed criminals escape justice? The right thing was to betray your oath, your badge, everything I ever taught you about duty and honor? The right thing was to prevent good men from dying for someone else's lies. Ethan straightened, meeting his father's eyes without flinching. Cole Brennan never killed anyone who didn't deserve it. Jake Morrison was trying to save his brother. The others were just following orders from a corrupt federal marshal who set up the whole thing to line his own pockets. You don't know that. Yes, I do. Patterson's dirty, Dad. He's been working with outlaw gangs for months, feeding them information about prisoner transfers and bank shipments. The ambush was his idea, his plan, his way of getting rid of witnesses who might expose him. McKinnon shook his head, but Ethan could see uncertainty creeping into his eyes. Even if that's true, it is true, and you know it deep down. You've seen the evidence, heard the stories that don't quite add up. Patterson surviving when his partner died, the outlaws knowing exactly when and where to attack, the convenient way he showed up in our town just as Brennan was being transferred. The accusations hung in the air like smoke, each one building on the others until the weight of them became impossible to ignore. Around them, the other men shifted uncomfortably, beginning to see connections they'd been blind to before. Jesus, Tom Bradley muttered. The marshal? Really? Think about it, Ethan continued, pressing his advantage. How else would a gang of outlaws know about a federal prisoner transfer? How else would they know which route to take, what time to attack? Patterson set it up, then played the hero when it went sideways. McKinnon was quiet for a long time, his weathered face working through the implications. When he finally spoke, his voice was tired, aged. Maybe you're right. Maybe Patterson is dirty. Maybe those men had reasons for what they did. But that doesn't change what you did, son. That doesn't change the fact that you chose them over us. I chose what I thought was right over what was easy. Same thing. The words hit like a slap. Ethan stared at his father, seeing not the towering figure of authority he'd grown up revering, but an old man whose world had suddenly become too complicated for the simple certainties that had sustained him for 20 years. Is it? Ethan asked quietly. Is choosing right over easy really the same as choosing them over us? When them includes the man you're in love with? Yeah, I'd say it is. The accusation hung between them, brutal in its honesty. Ethan felt heat rise in his cheeks, felt the eyes of every man in the canyon fixed on his face with uncomfortable intensity. Maybe it is, he said finally. Maybe I did choose him over duty. But you know what? I'm not sorry. The words seemed to echo from the canyon walls, defiant and irreversible. McKinnon stared at his son as if he were looking at a stranger, his weathered face cycling through emotions Ethan couldn't read. Then I guess we don't have anything else to talk about, McKinnon said finally. Tom, place Deputy McKinnon under arrest. Charges of aiding and abetting wanted fugitives, interfering with a lawful arrest, and whatever else the federal prosecutor wants to add. Sheriff, Tom started, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Do it. McKinnon's voice was flat, final. He's confessed to criminal acts. The law is the law, regardless of who breaks it. Tom moved reluctantly toward Ethan, handcuffs gleaming in the afternoon sunlight. But before he could complete the arrest, the sound of hoofbeats echoed from the canyon mouth. Everyone turned to see a single rider approaching fast, his horse lathered with sweat and exhaustion. As the rider drew closer, Ethan recognized him as Bill Morrison, the hotel clerk from Tombstone. The man was barely staying in his saddle, his face gray with fatigue and something that looked like fear. "Sheriff McKinnon," Bill called as he slumped from his horse. "You Sheriff McKinnon?" "That's right. What's wrong?" "Got word from the territorial capital. Federal investigators been looking into Marshal Patterson, following up on some irregularities in his reports." Bill paused, gulping air. "They found evidence, bank records, correspondence with known outlaws, money hidden in accounts under false names." McKinnon's face went pale. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying Patterson's been arrested for conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder. I'm saying everything he told you about that ambush was a lie." Bill's exhausted eyes found Ethan's face. "I'm saying your boy was right." The silence that followed was absolute. 15 men standing in Devil's Canyon, processing the implications of what they'd just heard. Patterson, the federal marshal they'd trusted, had been the real villain all along. The men they'd been hunting were guilty of nothing more than trying to survive in a world that had branded them criminals for someone else's sins. And Ethan, the deputy sheriff they'd been about to arrest for betraying his oath, had been the only one willing to see the truth. "Son of a bitch," someone muttered. The kid was right. McKinnon looked at his son with eyes that held pain and pride and something that might have been understanding. "It seems he was." "So what now?" Tom asked, the handcuffs still dangling from his fingers. McKinnon was quiet for a long moment, staring at the passage where 6 wanted men had disappeared into the vastness of the American frontier. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Now we go home. We tell everyone that the outlaws escaped through a hidden passage, and that's the end of it. No arrests, no charges, no more questions about who knew what when." "And Deputy McKinnon?" McKinnon looked at his son, and for the first time in days, something like warmth crept into his weathered features. Deputy McKinnon showed exceptional judgment under difficult circumstances. His actions prevented unnecessary bloodshed and helped expose corruption within the Federal Marshal Service. The words were formal, official, the kind of language that would look good in reports and newspaper accounts. But underneath the bureaucratic phrasing, Ethan heard something else: forgiveness, understanding, maybe even a grudging respect for the choice he'd made. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly. "Don't thank me yet, son. We still need to talk about what happens next." They rode back to Mercy Ridge in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts about justice and duty and the thin line between heroism and betrayal. The sun was setting as they crested the ridge that gave the town its name, painting the prairie in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Ethan painfully of another sunset, another moment when everything had changed forever. Cole was out there somewhere, probably riding hard for Mexico or California or any of a dozen places where a wanted man could disappear. By now, he was miles away, safe from pursuit, free to start over wherever his horse carried him. And Ethan was here, wearing his father's forgiveness like an ill-fitting coat, trying to figure out how to live with the choices he'd made. That night, after the horses had been tended and the other men had gone home to their families, McKinnon found his son sitting on the porch of the sheriff's office, staring out at the road that led away from everything he'd ever known. "You thinking about following him?" McKinnon asked, settling into the chair beside his son. "Would it matter if I was?" "Probably not. You're a grown man, Ethan, old enough to make your own choices, live with your own consequences." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of Mercy Ridge settling into sleep. Finally, McKinnon reached into his vest pocket and pulled out something that gleamed in the moonlight. Ethan's badge. "Thought you might want this back," McKinnon said, offering it to his son. Ethan stared at the star, remembering the weight of it, the responsibility it represented, the way it had felt to wear his father's pride on his chest. "You sure about that?" "Sure as I can be about anything these days." McKinnon's smile was tired but genuine. "Truth is, son, I need a deputy I can trust. Someone who will tell me when I'm wrong, stand up for what's right even when it costs him something. Even when what's right goes against the law? Especially then. McKinnon leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful in the moonlight. 20 years I've been wearing a badge, and I always thought the law was simple, right and wrong, black and white, good men and bad men. But maybe it's not that simple. Maybe sometimes good men have to break bad laws to serve real justice. Ethan took the badge